Now, this was not the first time that Monet had appeared in French fiction. In fact, there's a novel by Émile Zola called L'œuvre, the work. It's usually translated as the masterpiece in English, and you can buy it in the Oxford World Classics. And it's the story of two boys who are brought up together in Aix-en-Provence, who go to Paris to make their names. And indeed, it's largely the story of Émile Zola himself and Paul Cézanne. Cézanne and he were close boyhood friends. But in the novel, either to avoid libel action or because he wants to make the character richer, he mixes Monet's ideas with those of Cézanne. And the picture he gives of in the book is of an artist totally dedicated to what he wants to do, who will not compromise, which of course is what Monet did. And one of the friends, the man called Sandoz in the novel, becomes a famous novelist, while Lantier, the painter, becomes a failure. Now, he portrays very clearly Monet's early life in that. Monet's early life was excruciatingly poor. He was forever doing moonlight flits because they couldn't pay the bills for this and that. And indeed, the fact that he wasn't in France for the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was the fact that he had done the flit to England to get away from his debtors. And he was much sustained by the admiration of the painters of the time. Many of those richer Impressionist painters were quite well off, incidentally. There was one called Caillebotte, who actually played a lot of pity there's none of his pictures here. They're lovely. He died quite young, so there are not very many of them. And he helped the Monets live. They paid the bread and butter. But they were forever being done. The poverty was extreme. And it's this that Zola puts into his novel. And the novel was published in 1886, and it ends with the failure of the Monet character. Well, 1886 is about the year that the tide changed for Monet, and instead of being the execrated artist, the mad, silly, confidence trickster that the critics said that he was, they were beginning to take him seriously. So it's a pity that Zola wrote that novel a little too early. He sent copies to Cézanne, who never spoke to him again, and one to Monet, who said, it's very uncomfortable. And but the novel is extremely good. Zola incorporates much of the knowledge that we know about Monet into the book. As I say, Cézanne never spoke to him again. What I'm really talking about this evening is the evolution of Monet's reputation and the strange sea change that took place in the 1880s, which referred to in the lecture downstairs. Well, first of all, in 1862, he'd come to Paris and he made his first connections with the Impressionist painters like Manet, Renoir, and Pissarro. He had made those first connections. And of course, this is the period of his greatest poverty. He goes to Argenteuil because it's less expensive than living in Paris. He moves away to a village nearby because the creditors were there. And in 1874, there was the first Impressionist exhibition at which Leroy, the critic, he was really a satirist, he wasn't really a painter's critic, coined the word impressionist. Impression Sunrise, which is a picture of Le Havre Harbour, and it's in the Marmottan Museum in Paris occasionally. It was stolen in 1985 and returned in 1990, so be lucky if it's there when you go. That gave, as so often, a derogatory term became the title of the movement, like the Fauve, also a derogatory term initially. But they sold no paintings. It was terrible. 1875, there was another exhibition. He sold nothing. And then in 1878, there was a big sale, a mass sale, and the pictures went for the equivalent of $10. Nothing sold. He was not selling at all. But then things began to change. And although it was a total failure in 1878, in 1882, the critics started to take him seriously, and he started to win praise. Now, there are several reasons for this. We get used to things after a while, of course. Slowly being presented with something, it becomes familiar, and we cease to see the shock, and we see the thing itself. That's one of the reasons. But there were other things at work, and that was the ideas changing that I think were particularly influential from the great salons of Paris. And that's going to be the major subject that I'm going to talk about this evening. The way that the French atmosphere was changed by these grand dames of the salons. So things began to change, and in 1889 he did a big exhibition with Rodin, and suddenly he was the flavor of the month. Suddenly people were buying his pictures at respectable prices, so well that the house that he'd been living in at Giverny he could now afford to buy. So he bought it in 1890. And so the change was quite sudden. And in 1891, even the Queen of Sweden asked him to go to Sweden, and he went there and painted pictures in Sweden. And he was slowly being accepted in the salons by the gratin. The gratin means the cheese topping of a dish, of course, breadcrumbs and cheese, and this is the popular word for the upper classes in Paris, the top cheese, so to speak. And he was suddenly the choice of the gratin. And he started to acquire very powerful friends. And this was confirmed in 1894 with the Dreyfus affair. Now, for those of you who've been asleep for the last 100 years, the Dreyfus affair was, in fact, when Lieutenant Dreyfus, a Jew, was accused of passing secrets, French military secrets, to the Germans. Turned out later that it was his superiors, a man called Esterhazy, who had done it. But nevertheless, he was tried, found guilty, and given life sentence on Devil's Island. People were absolutely outraged, and it divided French society completely into the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards, the people who supported Dreyfus and the people who didn't. And it showed very strongly the basic anti-Semitism of French society. And in the great salons, there were either Dreyfusards or anti-Dreyfusards, and neither the twain could meet. And through this affair, because Monet was much in support of Dreyfus, he was a Dreyfusard. Now, of course, the most famous work of literature to come out of this is Émile Zola's open letter, J'accuse, I accuse, which is one of the great tirades of history, one of the great attacks on the French establishment. And people like Monet and Marcel Proust were all for Dreyfus. The trial was reviewed in 1898, and Dreyfus began his exoneration. And it wasn't until several years later that he was actually pardoned. And he wasn't pardoned, but he was shown not to be